Just set boundaries. You've heard this, you've tried it, and you're still here, watching another video about toxic people. That's not because you're bad at boundaries. It's because the advice itself is incomplete. It treats toxic behavior like it's one thing. It's not. A gaslighter and an energy vampire operate on completely different mechanisms, and the strategy that silences one will backfire catastrophically on the other. But before I show you why, let me be fair to the advice I'm about to take apart. Here's what nobody acknowledges about toxic behavior. It isn't one thing. The word toxic has become this enormous catch-all that covers everything from a passive-aggressive coworker to a narcissistic parent. And somehow we're expected to handle all of them the same way. That doesn't work. That's like telling someone to take medicine without asking what the illness is. Research on emotional contagion, the work from Elaine Hatfield's lab, and more recent studies on stress response propagation shows that different types of negative interpersonal behavior activate completely different neurological pathways in your brain. Your body doesn't respond to a gaslighter the same way it responds to someone who drains your energy through sheer one-sided conversation. Your stress response is different, your cognitive load is different, and the way your brain processes the interaction is fundamentally different. So the real question isn't, should you protect yourself? Obviously you should. The real question is how, based on who you're dealing with. And the answer changes completely depending on the type. Today, we're going to cover 4 types, each with their own counter strategy and an exact script you can use as early as tomorrow morning. The first type is the person who rewrites reality. You know them by their favorite phrases. That never happened. You're remembering it wrong. You're being too sensitive. The gaslighter doesn't argue with your position. They argue with whether the thing happened at all. And that's what makes them uniquely dangerous. They don't attack what you said. They attack your right to have perceived it. Over time, the target stops trusting their own memory. You start rehearsing conversations in your head before they happen, not to prepare, but to make sure you'll have proof that they actually occurred. I spent 8 months working under someone like this, and the most disorienting part wasn't the lies. It was how I started doubting myself preemptively before any conversation even began. That's the real damage, not the individual incidents, but the slow erosion of your confidence in your own mind. Here's the counter strategy, and it has 2 parts. First, contemporaneous documentation. Not journaling, not venting to friends, actual time-stamped records. After every significant conversation, write down what was said, when it was said, and who was present. Use your phone, use email, use whatever you'll actually stick with. Keep it factual, keep it short, keep it dated. This isn't about building a legal case, it's about building a personal anchor to reality. Second, the broken record technique. When the gaslighter says, "That never happened," your response is always the same, delivered calmly and without escalation. I remember it differently. Here's what I wrote down at the time. You don't argue about whose memory is correct. You don't defend your perception. You state your record and you move on. Here's why this works on a neurological level. Gaslighting depends entirely on destabilizing your certainty. The moment you have an external reference point, something written, something concrete, something that exists outside of the conversation, their primary weapon loses its edge. You're no longer fighting on the battlefield of memory, and memory is the battlefield they chose specifically because they always win there. The second type operates through a completely different mechanism. The passive-aggressive person will never confront you directly. They'll never say what they actually mean. Instead, you get the backhanded compliment. Wow, that's actually really good for someone who started so recently. You get weaponized silence. 3 days of nothing, then a cheerful, "I'm fine," when you finally ask what's wrong. You get the half-done favor. They agreed to help, but they did it so poorly that you wish they hadn't bothered. The reason passive aggression is so exhausting isn't the behavior itself. It's the ambiguity. You can never be entirely sure if you're overreacting or if something real just happened. And that uncertainty is the entire strategy. It gives them deniability while keeping you off balance. The counter strategy is what I call the mirror move. Name the behavior out loud, but neutrally, not as an accusation, as an observation. Here's the script. It seems like something's bothering bothering you. I'd rather we talk about it directly. No drama, no emotional charge, no finger pointing. When you name the pattern calmly, you remove the camouflage that passive aggression depends on. The person now has two options: deny it and look transparent to everyone watching, or actually say what they mean. And here's the part that most advice leaves out. Most people who rely on passive aggression don't do it because they're malicious. They do it because direct confrontation feels genuinely unsafe to them. By making directness feel calm and non-threatening, you short-circuit the pattern at its source. You're not calling them out, you're inviting them in, and that distinction changes everything about what happens next. The third type is harder to identify because there's no drama to point at. The energy vampire doesn't yell, doesn't manipulate, doesn't gaslight. They just leave you completely depleted after every single interaction. Every conversation orbits their problems, their stress, their situation. If you share something about your own life, they listen for about 4 seconds before redirecting back to themselves. There's no reciprocity, and honestly, there never was. And here's the uncomfortable part that makes this one uniquely tricky. They're often genuinely nice people. They're not malicious. They're just entirely unaware, which means most toxic people advice falls apart here because you're not dealing with a villain. You're dealing with a pattern. The counter strategy is the tactical time box combined with one specific redirect question. When the conversation starts, set a frame immediately. I have about 10 minutes. What's the most important thing? That's not rude. That's structured. It signals that the conversation has a shape, which prevents the drift into the usual 90-minute venting loop. And when the 10 minutes start circling toward the familiar spiral of problems without solutions, deploy the redirect. What are you going to do about it? That single question changes the entire dynamic of the interaction. It shifts the conversation from emotional dumping, where your job is to absorb, to problem solving, where their job is to act. Most energy vampires, once they realize the relationship has structure and expectation, will either adapt to it or quietly find someone else to drain. Both outcomes work in your favor. The fourth type is the one that makes everything we just covered feel simple by comparison. The controller, the narcissist, the person who needs to win every exchange, every conversation, every decision, no matter how small. They move goalposts constantly, so you can never quite meet their standard. They punish disagreement, sometimes with explosive anger, sometimes with cold withdrawal. They turn everything into a competition, including conversations that were never supposed to be won. And here's the part nobody covers, the part that actually matters. What do you do when you can't leave? Because a significant number of the people watching this right now are dealing with a controller who is also their boss, their co-parent, their family member. Just walk away is not a strategy when you share a custody schedule. It's not a strategy when your rent depends on your next paycheck. The counter strategy for this specific type, the person you cannot simply remove from your life, is strategic agreement combined with private documentation. Here's the script. You may be right about that. Let me think about it. And I know exactly what you're thinking right now. That sounds like surrender. It isn't. When a controller hears agreement, they lose their fuel. The entire dynamic is built on opposition. They need you to push back so they can push harder, escalate further, and ultimately prove that they were right all along. You may be right takes the fight out of the room without conceding anything real. Let me think about it. Buys you time and space to make your actual decision later, outside the pressure of their presence. And meanwhile, and this is the part that holds everything together, you're privately documenting the pattern. Not for revenge, not for ammunition in the next argument, for clarity. Because when you're inside the dynamic, day after day, the individual incidents blur together and you lose perspective. Controllers are masters at making you feel like you're the unreasonable one, and documentation is the only way to step outside the distortion field and see the pattern for what it actually is over weeks and months. Now here's the part of this video that's going to make some of you uncomfortable, and I considered not including it. We just spent 10 minutes identifying the toxic people in your life and learning exactly how to respond to each one. All of that is real, and all of it works. But there's a question worth sitting with, and it's one I had to sit with myself. Have you ever been one of them? Not as your core identity. I'm not suggesting you're a narcissist, but have you ever caught yourself deflecting when someone gave you honest feedback, rewriting the conversation in your head so you were the reasonable one? Have you ever gone quiet for 2 days instead of saying what was actually wrong? Have you ever dominated a conversation with your own problems when the other person clearly needed the space? I have, more times than I'm comfortable admitting, and recognizing those patterns in myself didn't make me the villain of my own story. It made me dramatically better at the strategies I just described. Because the person who understands their own deflection is the same person who can spot a gaslighter across the room. The person who notices their own passive aggression is the person who knows exactly how to name it in someone else. These tools work in both directions, and the people who refuse to turn the lens on themselves are usually the ones who stay trapped in everyone else's patterns indefinitely. You don't need to be smarter than the toxic person in your life. You just need to stop playing a game that only has one set of rules, theirs. Every type we covered today relies on a specific pattern, and every pattern has a specific breaking point. Find the pattern, break it, and their power over the interaction disappears. Not through confrontation, not through arguments you'll never win, through clarity. Drop in the comments which type you're dealing with right now. I'll respond to as many as I can. And if you recognized yourself in that last section, say that too. Those are the comments I respect the most.